Franco Moretti is a pioneer of digital research in literary science and is well known especially for his concept of close and distant reading. He has started his career in Italian university in Salerno and Verona. In 1990, if I'm right, he has moved to US and started to teach at University of Columbia. In 2000, he has moved to Stanford University, where he has, in 2010, co-founded famous Stanford literary lab. So, if you are able to count, and I do hope that you are, you fully understand the reason why Franco Moretti is in year 2020 directly here in Prague. It is, as far as I know, his first public speech in Prague, not in Czech Republic, because it is an off-record information. Yesterday he was speaking in Brno, but it's really off-record. And today we shall be given a presentation or a lecture with the title Simulating Dramatic Networks. This lecture is organized by the occasion of publishing or release of the new issue of ArteActa journal, where essay of Franco Moretti with title Network Theory, Plot Analysis, I do hope that I am right with the title, was or is published. This essay was translated by a colleague of mine, František Podhajský, who will be later moderating the discussion and who is taking a care about Professor Moretti during his whole stay in Czech Republic. So, these are the basic information from my side for the beginning of the lecture. Please enjoy this lecture, and I hope you will be given a fascinating speech. And I will pass the word to Jan Jiřík, Chief Redactor of ArteActa Journal, who will be shortly introducing to you this new issue.
Good morning, and my presentation, because we are presenting the Czech journal, so it's going to be in Czech. Dobrý den, dámy a pánové, já moc krát děkuji za váš zájem a za to, že jste přišli dneska si poslechnout přednášku pana profesora Morettiho, a rád bych stručně představil náš časopis. To je časopis, který začal vycházet v roce 2018 při Akademii múzických umění v Praze. Časopis ArteActa se zabývá performativním uměním v takovém širším rozumění, to znamená oblasti divadla, audiovize, tance, hudby, a zároveň také se pokoušíme vymezovat a hledat cesty k uměleckému výzkumu. Je to odborný časopis, který vychází dvakrát ročně. Publikujeme jednak studie, které prochází recenzním řízením právě z oblasti performativního umění a uměleckého výzkumu, a také v části, která je nerecenzovaná, různé delší texty, studie, eseje, překlady a tak dále, kterými se snažíme obohatit diskuzi právě na poli performativního umění a uměleckého výzkumu. Jeden z těch esejí je třeba právě již zmíněná přednáška, esej pana profesora Morettiho, kterou najdete v právě vyšlém 3. čísle našeho časopisu. Ten časopis, kdo z vás by se ho chtěl pořídit, tak je tady dostání ve foaje, nejen toto číslo, ale vlastně všechny 3 čísla, která jsme vydali. Jinak další informace o našem časopise naleznete na webu ArteActa.cz. Já vám děkuji pozornost, and now we can start with the main program of our today's meeting. So Franco, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you. Thank you for this. There are 2 things I have to explain about the title, simulating and dramatic networks. Let me begin with the second one, which is the easiest one. This is what I mean by that. This is the first tragedy that we have in full, as you know. There are 5 characters. I may call them nodes every now and then, that's the technical term. They're linked in the way we do things, not in the way everybody does things. They're linked if they speak to each other. Other people construct networks on different bases. For us, speech, for me especially, speaking to someone in a play is the way to establishing, not only to establishing a connection, but it's the most specific way of acting in drama. Parler, c'est agir, as a French theoretician at the time of Racine said it, but there are endless statements in that direction, that dialogue is the essential act of drama. So, dramatic network constructed on exchanges between characters. The width of those links, or edges as they're called, the width indicates the amount of dialogue that runs between two characters. The arrowhead indicate the direction of the dialogue. So for instance, the messenger speaks a lot to Atossa, a lot less to the chorus, not at all to Darius and Xerxes, and Darius speaks more to the chorus than the chorus to Darius, etc., etc. This is a dramatic network. The first time I presented on networks, there was someone in the audience who was a simpler network than this. I mean, it was larger, it was Hamlet, but without all these elements. And this person said, okay, this is an interesting idea to turn a play into a structure like this, but I'm a mathematician. And as a mathematician, I only feel that I really understand something if I know how to make it. How to make it with equations, obviously. So, how do you make this? What are the elements to construct, to make a dramatic network? What are the rules? What are the stages? He asked me this question, it was almost 10 years ago, apropos of the essay that has been translated in ArteActa. And back then I had no idea how to reply, because ours, literary study, is a field where the object of study is so emphatically given, right? Texts are passed on from generation to generation with extreme care. Many of you do that. We've invented a whole discipline, philology, that does that. Not only with care, often even with reverence. So the idea that you would make Antigone or Hamlet sounded half absurd, half almost sacrilegious to me back then. Then, however, the thought stays with my mind, can we make this? And this is my object today. I will not speak of plays, or only indirectly. I will speak of the networks that can be extracted from the plays. And in reality, I will not even speak about the actual networks. This is a network that measures certain variables of Persians as they are. No, I will talk about the simulations of these networks, the making of these networks. And in the conviction that, simulation, of course, is a word that, especially in common language, still has negative connotations, but as Evelyn Fox Kellerová, the philosopher of science, epistemologist, has put it, in recent years, simulations has actually lost the earlier sense of ontological inferiority, the sense of being a pretender, a pretense, and has eventually come to constitute an alternate reality. An alternate reality, this is exactly the point of making the simulations I'm going to show you today. They allow to imagine, we historians, it's a well-known fact, we cannot run experiments with our objects. Alternate realities of simulations are not exactly the same as an experiment, but as, I think, as close to running an experiment as we can get. How to do that is what I'll try to explain today. So, we had to do something like this, and we decided to do it by using, well, at first actually we thought of something like the equivalent of a die with 100 faces. The messenger speaks about 19% of the words in the play. you construct a digital die with 100 faces. On 19 of these faces, you have messenger. Then you roll the die, and then, you know, eventually goes. And probably we would have come close to this, but the point is, we would have copied the network, but in a way that did not make us understand anything about it. Whereas the point of what I hope I'll show today is that the aim of constructing simulations is, yes, to reproduce reasonably well a certain structure, but more importantly, to do so in a way that allows you to understand something new about the structure. So it's a double task. You have to get close, and you have to get close by following procedures that are unusual for a literary critic, at least, and that may tell us something new. Bon. So we decided, okay, let's try to do this with an algorithm, a series of operations, which will proceed one verbal exchange at a time without having any idea of what the final shape of the network should be. More precisely, the algorithm was given 3 data from the text: the number of characters, inevitably, the total number of utterances, how many times they speak, also inevitably, and the number of scenes, which doesn't apply to Greek tragedy, which really wasn't broken into scenes, but to other models, yes. Then it started working, and since for our understanding of drama, the key dramatic action is speaking, the first thing that the algorithm has to do is to choose the first speaker. There are 5 characters here. Initially, they all have the same chances to speak, 20% each. Then the algorithm, in this case, does the equivalent of a roll of dice, chooses one of the 5 characters, character A. At that point, the first parameter comes into play. The simulation is regulated by 4 parameters. These first parameter say that it is set at 1.1. A is chosen. Next time that a character must be chosen, the 20% initial possibility of it is multiplied by 1.1. So A would have 22% possibility of being chosen, and the other characters 19.5 each, because they lose percentage points. Clearly, if you set the parameter higher, say to 2%, that 20% becomes 40%, and the other 4 characters drop to 15%. So this is a parameter that establishes the centrality of characters to the structure. We called it centrality, without much imagination. I mean, just you've chosen a speaker. Second action, second parameter, you have to decide who A is going to speak to. Same logic. 4 characters, 25% probability each. You roll, you chose B, you choose B, then the parameter comes into play. If it's set at 1.2, that 25% becomes 30% the next time. Making, therefore, more likely that the next time A speaks, B will be chosen as its addressee, as the recipient of the utterance. So what these first 2 parameters do, the first determines the fact that, say, Hamlet is more likely to speak in Hamlet than Polonius. The second parameter determines the possibility that when Hamlet speaks, he is more likely to speak to Horatio than to Rosencrantz. They determine the structural inequality that is very typical of dramatic networks. A speaks to B. Third question, third parameter, will be replied to A. Now, in most plays, and in fact in most events in our lives, when I speak to someone, the someone replies to me. So this parameter must start very high at 100% or very close to 100%, but must also drop very quickly to 0%, because in order to have a play, yes, you can have Darius speak to the chorus and the chorus speak to Darius and Darius speak, but then at a certain point they have to stop for other characters to come into action. So this character, this third parameter, the first two parameters are set for the entire play. This is recalculated every time a character speaks, because it must go from 100 to 0 within a certain number of... When it reaches 0, fourth question, fourth and last parameter, three basic things can happen. There was another character already on the scene, and it starts to speak. A new character comes onto scene and starts to speak, or the scene ends and we start from scratch, choosing the speaker, etc., etc. These are the four parameters, nothing else. And you, of course, regulate them. You see networks take shape, and I will show you a screenshot of the results that we get from these parameters. This is Antigone. You see, this is how the algorithm worked. It produced 30 different simulations of the network without names. This, as I said, it's A, B, C, D. 30 different simulations of the network. And then here, the simulations obviously are based on mathematics, on the data. And here, it is a statistical visualization of how precise or not precise the simulation had been. This has to do, if I'm not mistaken, with the centrality of the characters and the centrality of the edges, of the links between characters. And the real result is the blue dot that's here. And the red dots are the 30 simulations. And of course, the ideal is for the 30 simulations to be as close to the red dot, and then there are other details that we can go on. We can return all of this. I've kept it short because I think it's more interesting what follows. But this is what we had, and then of course we had the data as data and other types of visualization like this. Now, what will follow will be, to a large extent, an exercise in self-scrutiny and self-criticism. So let me begin with self-praise. The algorithm worked reasonably well. You had to manipulate, or they, because this began as a collective work. Now I'm doing the meta, the reflective part, and my colleagues are doing the experimental part. And they manipulated the parameter a little bit, and then the results slowly become, initially they were completely scattered, and then they slowly tended to coalesce, never perfectly, as we will see, but tended to improve. Now, it worked reasonably well, but we wanted to test it. And in order to test it, we decided to run it against 4 instances of actual tragedies. So all the plays, all the tragedies by Sophocles, by Shakespeare, by Racine, and the so-called bourgeois or realist cycle, the last 12 plays by Ibsen. And I will present the result as in order of increasing morphological complexity, and therefore also increasing complexity for the algorithm to simulate them well. And the first is well exemplified, the first network type. So I will be talking of 4 network types associated to these 4 actors. The first is very well expressed by this early play by Racine. As you can see, it's a small set of characters. It's very well connected. They almost all speak to each other. There are only 2 edges that remain void, characters who don't speak to each other. And the edges are reasonably balanced. They more or less speak the same amount of words to each other and listen and speak, and it's a very balanced network. Probably this has to do with the fact that it's an extremely homogeneous class world, which is typical of French classicism. Of these 6 characters, 3 are kings, 1 is a queen, 1 is the sister of a king, and the 6th is a plenipotentiary general. So that is what lies behind this extreme violence. Second network type, Ibsen, introduces a novelty. As you can see, the networks continue to be small and very well connected, but there is 1, 2, 3, or 4 edges that become clearly more prominent than the others, and that are usually associated with illicit or even illegal activities. Adultery, lying, blackmail, this kind of thing. Between Solness and Hilde in The Master Builder Solness, between Oswald and his mother and Pastor Manders in Ghosts, and between Nora and 3 or 4 characters in Dollhouse, her husband, frustrated lover, an old friend rival, and a blackmailer. And Hedda Gabler, incidentally, which is a completely different play from a Dollhouse, but also with a woman as the clear protagonist, has a very similar structure. It's interesting. Nora and Hedda are very different as the 2 great Ibsen heroines, but they find themselves in a structure, in a family and social structure that is remarkably the same. It's like Ibsen has conducted 2 studies. How can a woman react in 2 completely different ways to the same structure? So here there was a challenge. The previous network types, here this was easy to make. Basically you kept all parameters low, and the network came out well by itself. It was just an exercise in restraint from the viewpoint of programming. Here, no, here we had to find a way to make 1 or 2, 3 edges more prominent, and this was done by adjusting, by raising, especially one of the parameters that creates a bond between speaker and listener. And it's also an interesting peculiarity of dramatic networks. You see networks all the time. They're in newspapers, they're in advertising. Usually, almost always actually, the representation of networks does not include edge weight. All the edges, all the connections are the same width. It doesn't matter whether what matters is the number of connections, not the weight. In dramatic analysis, this is not true. The number matters, but edge weight matters probably even more. To speak is to act, yes, and it's usually to act on a specific character. You think of Antigone, you think of her confronting Creon. You think of Othello listening to Iago. Faust making his wager with Mephisto or seducing Margaret. So you see not just a character, you see a pair, an edge, a relationship. This is what we're trying to capture here. Third network type, Shakespeare. Here, clearly, what changes is size. From the 10 or fewer characters of Ibsen's and of Racine to 25, 30, even more than that. And the consequence of that is twofold. These networks, compared to the previous one, become a lot less dense and a lot more unbalanced. Less dense, as I'm now giving a close-up of this section of the Macbeth play. As you can see, there are here a dozen characters with only one connection to the rest of the play. So, and usually the connection is very tenuous. At times it's just a sentence. And then they also become much more unbalanced, and this is also, again, Macbeth is an extreme structure from this point of view. This is an histogram of the percentage of words uttered by Macbeth in the play. 1/3 of the words in the play are spoken by Macbeth. And then on the other hand, there are about 25 characters, the long tail of this. Put together, they speak less than half of what Macbeth speaks. This is, you know, the two typical structural features of Shakespearean network. Their sparseness, so there are so many characters that are there just for a second, and their unevenness. They're dominated by certain Hamlet, Macbeth, Lear, Othello. I mean, this is part of the Shakespeare myth, right? That he has been capable of creating these characters who so dominate the structure in which they are. Here too, something could be done by manipulating mostly the first of the 4 parameters that makes a character central, with results that began to be complicated. And this was the hardest network type to simulate. Was the hardest because, as you can see, in terms of number, in terms of size, number of characters, it's very similar to Racine and to Ibsen. 8, 9, 10 characters. But in terms of connections and density, it's actually very similar to Shakespeare. Many, many characters here are not connected to each other compared to an Ibsen play or a Racine play, even more. So the algorithm found very difficult to reconcile small size and low density. It kept working and working, but it always ended up connecting these networks, making the characters speak to each other more than they actually do. In other words, the algorithm got it wrong, and with that, we come to the point. Simulations, parameters, networks, and now results. Not all the results, they will be in the other study, in the experimental study, but at least one type of result, which is bad results. Results that you don't, that don't work well, and that human nature being what it is, at first, at least our human nature, we tried not to see. Yeah, it's true. The model tends to make these networks more connected than they actually are. But in the other cases, it didn't do that. Yes, it's true. Shakespeare's protagonists are only, to a certain extent, captured by the parameter. But with minor characters in Shakespeare, the algorithm works a lot better. So in other words, it's not like you deny that something is not working, but you're basically saying, well, it's a local problem. You know, it's limited. It doesn't really have to lead to a general rethinking here. You do it once, you do it twice, you do it 3 times. Reality tends to be stronger than our capacity for delusion, so at a certain point you have to confront it. And for us, this came with the discussion of an Ibsen play, Master Builder Solness, and specifically those 4 characters here on the left. Sorry, it's in Danish, Norwegian. One of the ladies, another lady, a voice, another voice. These are 4 characters who come into, well, 2 don't even come onto the scene. 2 are on the scene, 2 are outside. The final couple of minutes of the play. And what happened was that the algorithm kept connecting them to the rest of the play. For some reason, this time we didn't simply say, hey, but it doesn't matter, these are 4 minor characters, even if it gets them wrong. We sort of stepped back and said, well, okay, what do we really want from our simulations? Because if we want our simulations to be good approximation of the actual network, then it's clear what we have to do. We have to keep manipulating the parameters, maybe add another parameter or two, and eventually we will get a way of almost reproducing this structure. But there will be a price. Increasing the number of parameters, increasing the different settings for the parameters, the whole process becomes more opaque. Yes, you reproduce it better, but you lose control of what allowed it to reproduce it better. On the other hand, if you keep the model simpler, like ours, you will get worse results, but you will understand what is going on. So, better reproduction or transparency? This was more or less the choice. Of course, in an ideal world, one would want to have both approximation and transparency, but if one really has to choose, well, then transparency it is, at least for me. And you see, the reason for this is that why do we do simulations to begin with? We don't do them in order to reproduce reality. Reality already exists. You don't need to copy it. You need to more or less copy it in order to understand something about it. Need something else. Historical research, this is Weber in his essay on objectivity in social science and social policy, which is the essay in which he presents the concept of the ideal type. Historical research faces the task of determining in each individual case the extent to which the ideal construct, the ideal type, the concept, approximates to or diverges from reality, to what extent, for example, the economic structure of a certain city is to be classified as city economy. See, this is the point here, that the ideal construct, so the concept, the ideal type, that the concept may approximate or diverge from a specific city, that our model may diverge more from Ibsen's master builder than, say, from Ibsen's ghost. This, for Weber, is not a setback. This is a condition of knowledge. The distance between concept and reality, more precisely, the variable distance between a single concept and the many realities to which it's applied, between the single algorithm and the many Ibsen plays to which it's applied, this distance is inevitable. We shouldn't try to abolish it. We should try to liberate its explanatory potential. In this sense, where did the distance between Ibsen's master builder and the model's master builder come from? Why was it so much greater in that case than in Ghosts? Probably for this reason. Because, as I told you a minute ago, the model built its networks on the basis of what we could call the physiology of an Ibsen network. And that physiology does not envision the possibility of creating 4 new characters at the very last minute to utter a sentence or two and then disappear. With Shakespeare, it would be no problem at all. With the 30 and more characters that we had seen in those plays, this is plenty of minor characters, as Alex Wallach has called them. So, you know, and the model could actually get them reasonably well. But in Ibsen's world, in this world of reiterated meetings among well-known faces in small spaces, etc., it was illogical for a character to, these are all, as you know, plays that take place in a drawing room, among people who know themselves well, who've known themselves for 10 years, 20, 30. It's illogical within this model to introduce a few characters, have them speak a sentence and then disappear. The algorithm was logical, followed logic, and got it wrong. The point is, was the model wrong? Or was Ibsen? See, this is alternate reality. This is the point of alternate reality. You run an experiment and say, oh, what if the master builder we construct actually makes more sense than what Ibsen did. Under some respect, of course. We're not claiming it's a better play. So you look again at all the 12 Ibsen plays, and I realize there are 3 other scenes that resemble that final scene of the Master Builder. They are the so-called procession that closes his first play, Pillars of Society, the dinner that opens The Wild Duck, and the town meeting in An Enemy of the People. And these are 4 scenes that they all have not only various minor characters, but they also have a certain inclination to melodrama, strong inclination to melodrama, which is very much at odds with Ibsen's general poetics, which is one of relentless clarity and truth-telling, not sentimental melodrama. So, you realize that whenever a situation like the clash between simulation and actual network had brought to light, whenever that happened, there was a certain type of scene. And there was that, so to speak, quantitative divergence was the sign of a dramatic divergence of certain scenes from the rest of the Ibsen corpus. So the question, where did this dramatic divergence come from? Ibsen's realist cycle has a very clear ambition, grabbing the dark side of modern private life and endowing it with a public dimension, as is typical of the theater. The problem is, this is not an easy thing to do. And nothing reveals it better than that final scene of Dollhouse that is probably the masterpiece of political Ibsen. It's Nora launching into a very sharp j'accuse against all sorts of public institutions, the law, marriage, education, the justice system, etc. All these public institutions. It's really a moment of extraordinary polemical enlightenment, but within the 4 walls of a bourgeois drawing room. Ingmar Bergman, who staged the play in the 50s for the theater, with a stroke of genius, put it in the bedroom, as if to even strengthen the dissonance between the public argument and the private dimension of bourgeois life. Where does the divergence of those 4 scenes from the central axis, from the physiology of Ibsen's work come from? I think from here, from the difficulty of making modern private life significant in a public way, which must have generated on and off in Ibsen the desire for a different solution. Instead of well-known characters whose private life is turned towards the public eye, having some characters without a name, without a body often, without a past, without a life, that just represent the public as such. A shortcut, a dramatic shortcut. Scenes in which this elusive public exists as such. It's completely comprehensible. This, of course, is my speculation, but it's a completely comprehensible temptation. There is a problem. They never become integrated in the rest of Ibsen's dramaturgy. He tries it once, he abandons it for 5 or 6 years, tries it again, abandons it again, tries it again. It's like something that he keeps returning to, but it never really works, it never really changes the way he writes plays. Other changes occur, but not this. It never becomes physiological. Was the model wrong? Was Ibsen wrong? Racine. This is a later play, Andromaque. And compared to what I showed you earlier, which was Alexander Grande, there is a novelty very visible, these edges here, these 4 edges between Hermione and Cléon, Oreste and Pylade, Pyrrhus et Phoenix, Andromaque et Céphise. And in itself, we've just discussed this for Master Builder. There are characters in Shakespeare and Ibsen that exist that have a single link to the rest of the network. But there is an enormous difference. In Shakespeare and also in the Master Builder, if there is only one link, that link is always very, very weak. Here, the links are very strong, are among the strongest. In itself, this is not a surprise. Everybody knows, everybody who studies the tragédie classique knows that many of these plays use so-called confidants. So the main characters, male and female, have very often, each of them, someone who can be a preceptor, who can be a friend, who can be a servant, an ex-governess, whatever, a confidant, someone with whom they engage in long scenes of dialogue. So in itself, this is not a surprise. It's typical of the tragédie classique, but only of the tragédie classique. So initially our model, which was being tested on very different structures, it was difficult for us to model a result like this. Then increasing a couple of parameters solved the situation, or at least improved matters. But you see, the real lesson here was not that by moving the parameters we could get closer to the actual network of Racine's. The lesson was how far from their usual settings the parameters had to be moved in order to do that. So the extent of the variation was a sign of how big a distortion the confidants introduced within dramatic structure. And in fact, those of you who know the history of the theory of tragedy, it's filled with invectives against the confidants as a supremely unrealistic, undramatic figure to have. Was the model wrong? Was Racine wrong? Determine in each individual case the extent to which the ideal type approximates to or diverges from reality. This was Weber again, I had quoted. Determine the extent of divergence. That, I think, is the problem. The alternate reality of simulation doesn't have to approximate each individual network equally well. That's not the point of constructing a model. The point is to make the distance between concepts and different realities measurable and hence potentially understandable. Measurable, it's clear how. Because, as I said, the variation in parameter setting becomes a perfect analog of the morphological variation they're trying to capture. So the distance between concept and reality becomes measurable. Understandable? Well, understandable in this sense, at least, as Massimo Paci, an Italian sociologist, has observed. Observing the amount of divergence from the ideal type is the first step towards causal imputation in historical research. And it is the first step in this sense. That which in a structure like this most diverges from the norm is simultaneously two things. It's that which most demands an explanation because it contradicts what we're used to, but it's also what most makes it possible, because it is the sign that a force has intervened in order to operate that change. As Darcy Thompson put it in his great book on growth and form, the form of any portion of matter, whether it be living or dead, may in all cases be described as due to the action of force. In short, the form of an object is a diagram of forces, from which we can deduce the forces that have acted upon it. So deducing historical forces, like the intranslatability of private and public in Ibsen, deducing historical forces from the morphological transformations that measurement makes explicit. Here, form and history are very, very well integrated. Unfortunately, it's not the end of this paper. The end is very near, but it will be slightly different. A very large part of morphology, this is Darcy Thompson again, lies in the comparison of related forms rather than in the precise definition of each of them. Now, as many of you know, the comparison of related forms is the object of the only image that appears in Darwin's Origin of Species. There is literally only one image. It's this. The diagram, as Darwin calls it, where the vertical axis represents the passing of time, thousands of generations, and the horizontal axis represents the morphological divergence, or the formal variety, between the species indicated here at the bottom, some of which die out, some of which diverge, and the lesson of this diagram for Darwin, for someone who reads Darwin, is that here morphology and history are literally the two dimensions of the same figure. Literally, one is the x and one is the y-axis. There are no forms without history. This is the point. Each form is what it is because it has become such in the course of time. This is, of course, the great point of the theory of evolution. Our experiment followed a different path because the model was tested against the history of tragedy, yes. It even managed to follow many of its zigzags. But the passage of historical time that is so crucial to this diagram remained actually external to the work we were doing. There was, in our work, in the experiment, there was really no equivalent to Darwin's thousands of generations, or perhaps worse, there was an equivalent. Remember when I showed you that screenshot of what the algorithm produced? Every time, the algorithm produced 30 versions of a single play. Potentially, we had there 30 generations. We never looked at them in that way. For us, they were simply statistical variations. We never thought of trying to conceive of them in an evolutionary manner. We were looking at these networks that were taking shape in front of our eyes. So they were taking shape in time, but it was a different kind of time from historical time. It was laboratory time. It's the time that you establish in a laboratory. You divide it from the time of history, it becomes a purely mechanical succession. Very useful in many ways. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it has nothing to do with the time of history. We were conducting a morphological study which had severed its relationship to that. Exactly the opposite of what happens here. At the end of the experiment, we started talking of a periodic table of dramatic networks. That's how we called it. It was an idea as if to say, well, let's have a dream here and let's do this as it's been done for chemistry. Let's have just a table of all possible dramatic networks, of all forms. There is a beautiful sentence from Darcy Thompson. Of all forms that are theoretically imaginable, as Darcy Thompson puts it. But you see, of all forms that are theoretically imaginable, whether they have historically happened or not, what we had done was to completely disconnect morphology from history. Now, my life's work has been an attempt to link forms and history, to look at forms historically, to look at literary history morphologically, etc., etc. Why had I fallen into this trap of doing exactly the opposite of what I'd always done? My opinion, because once you start working in a lab, there is a logic, there is a practice, there is a logic to the practice, to the concrete work you do. You take certain decisions, and at first they feel perfectly harmless, even obvious, but they're not. The idea of starting the project, as I told you today, by constructing the model, and then bringing in real tragedies, only to test it, this went without saying. It seemed obvious. But in truth, it completely subordinated history to morphology. Morphology was the model, was the hypothesis, was the idea. Morphology was the work. History was a test. Now, maybe we were simply very wrong in working the way we did. In which case, it's very simple. People listen to this, read the article, they smile, they shrug, they say, well, they were very wrong, no one imitates us, it ends here. Maybe what happened to us is the sign of something, of an objective problem that is there. That is to say, of how radically can morphology, if it follows its own demon, its own logic, and look, what else is research if not following one's demon? How radically can morphology in that case move away from history rather than connect to it? Far from being predestined to happen, the encounter between forms and history may be a very unlikely outcome. It's completely worth trying it anyway, but it will require a lot of intelligence, a lot of patience, and especially a lot of luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Franco, for your Propion lecture. I think that the typology of dramatic networks is emerging. So thank you for this far-reaching contribution. Well, I'm here just as a holder of a microphone. I'm sure that you have a lot of questions, and Franco has a lot of slides. So don't hesitate to ask. We will distribute the microphone to you. And I on the right side, my colleague on the left side. So just give us a sign, an iconic one. Okay, I will start it. Oh, perfect.
In your lecture you mentioned the term reality. And I'm not sure that I understood if it's reality which is behind the play as a material of the play or the play itself.
Yeah, I think I used it. It's a term I use with much greater freedom than most people in literary studies do now. I have no problem using the term reality. In this case, I think I used it to mean two things. The actual plays, texts of the plays, but also the networks that have been extracted from the plays. There are two different levels of reality, obviously, but what mattered to me was the relationship between simulations and these two levels. At times usually I compare simulations to the reality of networks. Occasionally I compare them directly to the reality of the play. So this is what I meant by it. There was no further level of, actual material reality as in a staging of a play, etc. Yeah, maybe that moment when I mentioned Ingmar Bergman, but that was all. Yeah.
Another one. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just interested in how this would differ if you study some other literary genre. In particular, the cast of characters in a novel would seem to me much less restricted by certain pragmatic considerations. The novelist has limited number of pages maybe that the publisher is willing to publish, but otherwise can come up with as many characters as he or she wants, whereas the playwright needs to take the practicalities of the size of the stage, the size of the acting troupe, the amount of money it has to pay actors, might be traveling, and so on. And I mean, if you're studying only the great works, then we might presume they can include as many actors as they want, so if it's small, it's because there's some aesthetic reason for that. But if we expand it to study also various small works, then there might be a wide variety of considerations that are external to the kind of literary structure, or that actually bring us to other ways in which literary structure is connected to extra literary reality. So I wonder if there's something more to be said on that point.
Yes, I think you're right. There are all sorts of considerations, and not just the inner logic of a narrative structure that determines how plots are constructed. That said, we decided to test the model against 4 very well-known cases, and different among them, of tragic literature. There is no particular value to these 4 except that they are well known and different from each other and from different epochs. This study is not meant to give any exemplary value to Sophocles and the other 3. It's just using them to reflect on the logic of an abstract construct like the simulation. Other types of play will create different problems, I'm sure, but that's another issue. This is one thing that I've learned from doing this type of work is that it can only proceed, and it proceeds very slowly, much more slowly than literary studies usually do. This is a legend and completely false that quantitative work proceeds faster than older interpretive work. Older interpretive work, if you had an idea, it turned into a thesis and into a result in a matter of seconds. Here, it takes forever. And most results are inconclusive, etc., etc. It takes nothing if you don't care whether you have good results and good, but then it's not good scholarship. So if I've learned one thing is that this work can proceed only one step at a time. It took us years to do what I just presented. Yes, it could have taken us twice those years and done the things you mentioned, but then human life, unfortunately, has its limits. Only one thing about novels. If one thinks that translating plots into networks is a good idea, I think it's better to start from a simpler structure. And plays are a simpler structure than novels in this respect, because basically there are 2 criteria you can use for plays. If 2 characters speak to each other, there is a link, or if 2 characters are on scene together, there is a link. Even if someone doesn't speak, I disagree, yeah, you shake your head, I shake my head too, and don't do it, but I understand it's plausible. I mean, it's, with a novel, the number of possible becomes enormous. And what if a character remembers someone who in the novel is already dead? Does that count as a link? What if the narrator, while speaking as a narrator, mentions him and me in the same sentence? Does it have to be the same sentence? Some people use sentence, some people use paragraph, some people use chapter, etc., 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 etc. Do you see the problem? Then the number of variables becomes so hard to control that you get... you do a structure of Andromaque, more or less everybody will get a version of this. You do the same for Anna Karenina, it's a very different story.
Yeah, I guess I'm not really calling for an expansion of the scale, although, I mean, I think we all agree.
But you are, and you are right in doing it. It should be done, not necessarily by us.
But my question is more in terms of how we interpret this structure, because it's a structure that both is an aesthetic structure, but is also a structure of how you physically put a play together on stage. And
in the French court, yes. In this case, we decided we were interested, and especially I was interested, only in the literary structure as such. That the literary structure could be determined by the setting, say, whether it's the French court or a commercial theater in the midst of London, that was considered irrelevant, even though, you know, clearly that they have an effect on the structure. I have no problem with that.
So thank you very much for your lecture. It was rich, and I think we come all very enriched from it. I've got two questions. First, how do you relate to modèle actentiel? Because in examples you've been giving, there are so many things which we could relate to that theory. Especially thinking of Oreste in Racine's Andromaque, you know that he is a confidant in a way. So that could be interesting to see your diagrams, or maybe there are some more models you have created from studying this structure, and from what all the researchers following that modèle actentiel have done. I think that a question about the fiction and novels would be very interesting, but I think it's not doable. Like if you think of free indirect speech, for instance, you couldn't use the concept of a persona anymore. I mean, that would be very difficult. I can't imagine it. And again, this is very interesting because there have been critics in the 60s who dissolved actually a concept for persona, even for classical tragedy in France. It is not largely followed by specialists nowadays, and I'm happy it isn't. But so there are some like kind of conservative things in your modeling, but also, and that's what interests me, if you would take into account more that kind of a role of a persona in the dramatical structure. So I think it's not really questions, just observations. Thank you.
Yeah. So the modèle actentiel, this was a concept coined in the 60s from within French structuralism, and fundamentally the advantage of that model was that it no longer linked, correct me if I misunderstand what you're, it no longer linked the analysis of a narrative structure to its characters, but it grouped different characters together into the concept of the actant. So it was, personally, unlike most people who work in quantitative literary history and digital humanities, personally, I have been formed in depth by Russian formalism, to a lesser extent by French structuralism. So in general, these are, it's clear if one does a presentation like this. However, there is a big difference from the models that were created in the 60s. The Russian formalists didn't use visual models, or at least not in the text that I've known. But in France they did. The difference is that those models were not empirical in nature. They were logical relationships between characters, groups of characters, concepts in gray mass, semiotic square, etc., etc. Here, all visualizations have an empirical foundation. This makes the two attempts comparable but really different in nature. Now, the next step would be, okay, but why don't you take Andromaque and decide that there aren't, as here, 9 characters, of which one is the collective character, soldiers of Orestes. There are really only 4 actants. Orestes, Andromaque, Pyrrhus, and Hermione. This could be done. It would mean that the premise for all measurements is an interpretive act of a rather strong kind. You have 9 characters in the list of characters in the opening page of the text. You had it even in Racine's time. This is, and you decide that no, they're not 9, they're 4. So I'm not saying that it shouldn't be done. I'm just saying that this is not the way we have been proceeding so far, because we decided to take more common sense, initial, at times common sense, at times not common sense, but in this case, the common sense notion of characters. Is it clear? I mean, simultaneously, there is clearly a relationship and a difference in trying to establish a scientific approach to literature. I would say that especially structuralism, already formalism to some extent, it was a scientific attitude without a strong empirical basis. These kind of things tend to have a very strong empirical basis, often without a strong scientific attitude. If one has to choose between scientific attitude without empirical basis or empirical basis without scientific attitude, I choose this. I like better a logical diagram than an empirical diagram without an idea behind it. But the attempt here is to combine both. But it's not easy. Whence questions like yours. Yeah. Yeah.
So the next question from the last row.
Thank you. I was intrigued by one of your first slides, the one with the Lila package.
Sorry, which one?
It was the Lila package.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, this one. So these are just 30 simulations, you said, right? But we could run many more?
30, yeah. I mean, the screen was bigger than this. We just caught, yeah, of course, we could have run hundreds of them.
Yeah, so to bring it to some sort of inferential network statistics, like you could run 1,000 simulations. And what I found intriguing is that it seems that none of the characters in your plays actually falls outside of the scope of what the model generates as a sort of some random structure of the network, right? It seems to be, within, you don't get what I'm saying? So what you're doing there, basically you're saying like how many times, or is the centrality calculation on the graph?
Yeah.
Or what is plotted, right? So you plot in like the centrality from the simulations. And the characters in the actual plays have the centrality that falls within the scope of what would be expected if the networks were
You're talking about
randomly.
this now?
Yeah.
No, okay, let me explain a little better. So, say, Macbeth speaks 1/3 of the words in the play. This is not Macbeth, this is Antigone, so it would actually be Creon. Creon speaks, say, 20% of the words in the play. And it's the blue dot at the top left of the image here. In the 30 simulations, the 30 simulated Creons, kings of Thebes, are those 30 red dots there. And so then there are statistical measures whether the approximation is reasonable or not. But the ideal is for them to cluster as closely up as possible, a little bit higher, a little bit lower, but is this what you are referring to?
Yeah.
Then the question is what?
Well, let me get there. So basically what you're showing is that those characters in the actual play, the blue dots,
yeah,
are not significantly different from the simulations.
What I'm showing, no, I'm showing you what the relationship between the real and the simulated is. Whether the difference is significant or not, this is open to question. I mean, some people, as I said, there are some measures, but most of our results lay on the border, especially for Greek cases.
Yeah. So you could actually, that's why I think 30 simulations is not enough to make inferences. You would have to run 1,000. But the interesting part then, what I think becomes is are the parameters of your model.
Okay.
Because if you are able to set the parameters in such a way that the simulated statistics actually is able to reproduce the reality more or less, then what you are capturing really is like some sort of grammar of the construction of dramatic networks.
I agree, exactly. That is exactly the point.
So I think like it's interesting to focus on the parameters rather than the actual data. I mean, of course, you have to communicate between both of them, but the parameters is what I find really interesting.
But I did talk mostly about the parameters.
Yeah.
You see, I presented the data, but then when I was talking about the mistakes, I was talking about the parameters that had to be raised or lowered, and then I was talking about what they could not do. And in a sense, it was a way of talking about some aspects of the internal structure. You're totally right. If the parameters, if these 4 parameters can reproduce a dramatic structure reasonably well, then there must be a relationship between the parameters and some principle of dramatic construction. The problem is establishing this relationship. It's much easier, I think, to reproduce reality than to understand the relationship between your mathematical formulas, because that's what they are, and a playwright writing a play. There has to be a relationship if the two structures resemble each other. But how to put it into concepts, that's the real challenge. So if that was your question, that is, in my opinion, the question to be asked about this. It is so much the important questions that, you know, I didn't dare ask it because certainly we didn't have an answer for it.
I think it would be interesting to see more variation in the parameters, how they actually end up. But I fully agree with you. It actually takes much more time than people think to.
No, exactly. I mean, like, no, you're right. If we raise a parameter crazily, what happens to the structure? In a sense, it's a very delicate balance, and that's what made issues complicated. These simulated networks can go wrong very quickly, and very wrong. So it's almost artistry, keeping the parameters. But if it is that, then it means that it's very difficult to extricate the contribution of one parameter from that of the others, because of course they interrelate. So this is really preliminary, not only in respect, my previous, but also in respect to this. In respect to this. It's just the beginning in which we're beginning to see possible relationships, but certainly don't have the words, don't have the concepts for them. There's a guy there.
Yes, okay.
Thank you, Franco, very much for your talk. I think I have a question that builds up a little bit on what has been asked previously. It's a methodological question, and I think there is definitely a tension here, right, with respect to the method and what we can say with respect to the results. And of course, we know from science that we can use modeling and then data, at least in a couple of ways. We can first express a model, trying not to think about the data that we have, and then check if it works, with the idea of trying to come up with something that is generalization. Conversely, we can take a look at the data and try to model out something that is as close as possible to it to explain it in some way. And I'm still not sure, after your talk, of which kind of direction and approach did you take with respect to modeling. So did you try to express your model abstracting from your case studies, or were they intrinsically part of your process? I think maybe that might explain a little bit more your intentions and results.
Yeah, no, I think what we did was to think in those terms, okay, how do we construct something like this? So this type of reality, this type of empirical distribution was our starting point. Then nothing in this or in the quantities that go into making this, in the matrices of results, nothing told us create 4 parameters that do this, that, and that, nothing. So the model in that respect was completely independent of this data. It did not emerge from the data. And to be totally frank, I don't know where it emerged from. It was just, as is often is in this case, what seemed like ordinary common sense conversation that you don't even bother to take notes about, and then the thing starts crystallizing around you. So the model was independent from the data, but was designed to return to this distribution. I don't know whether that answers your question, but that's how we proceeded.
Okay, give me a sign. Yes.
Thank you for your lecture. At the beginning you said that you founded the models based on the number of utterances or speech, if I understand correctly. So if I understand correctly, the diagrams reflect interconnections or interactions rather among the actors, among the characters.
Yeah.
And my question is, I was wondering the whole time, how would the diagram change? Were you taking into account the nature of speech, not just what the characters or how they interact and how many times, let's say, but the nature of the speech, where, for example, in Shakespeare, the speech itself acts. It's not just that they speak to each other, the characters, but what and how actually they say it. Thank you.
This is another aspect. I mean, I've talked for 2 hours. We've been here for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and everything is based on language, but I haven't quoted, I think, a single line from a single play. So it's language in a purely quantitative fashion, without semantics at all. So I don't think the networks would change. Insofar, I think the network should be based on the quantity of language. However, semantics ought to be, how can one put it, screwed into the network. And that is, I think, another aspect of future research. What is the relationship between network structure and the semantic, but also stylistic, I use semantic to say all that contributes to the creation of meaning, nature of place. So it would be another layer. It would be, this is, we have theories of style and of literary semantics. We have theories of plot. I think that in general, theories of style have been more successful than theories of plot, I would say. Even though I'm more interested in plot, I would say that in general they've been more successful, probably because they can rely on language and a whole discipline of linguistics, and language being segmentable in much clearer ways than the plot is. Bon, I don't think that we've ever had a successful integration of theory of plot and theory of style. The two have developed completely independently of each other. Another reason to integrate semantics into networks, another reason that would make that interesting would be that it would make visible the relationship between a view of plot and a view of style. It would be a way of synthetically presenting the relationship between the two. So it is definitely the next step. In fact, we've already started for years working on network semantics. That also has all sorts of complications. So all sorts of complications just to say, you see, the difficulties that then stop a research project. Whereas you can generalize when you have to do with the quantities within dramatic networks, like I've said today. When you have to do with semantics, it's quite more complicated. Each play becomes much more unique, so to speak. So how do you extract semantics without completely betraying the uniqueness of it? Just creates problems of a second order. Yeah.
Thank you. I will pose maybe a simple question, but as far as I understood, you have checked your model basically on the tragedies. Have you tested maybe also the comedies, and do you see any differences between these two types of dramas?
Yeah, yeah, we tested it on tragedies because I know tragedy much better than comedy, and of the four who did the thing, I was the one who was most interested in theater, but we did look at some comedies. The main differences, this is very clear in Shakespeare, is that comedies tend to be smaller and much more interconnected. So the structure is different, the logic is more or less the same, but the type of play is different. Yeah, that's really all we have, and we realized it was too different. That's why, you know, in the end, this should have been entitled Simulating Tragic Networks, not Dramatic Networks, because, yeah, a generalization to drama is improper.
Okay, any other question? Okay, three other.
Thank you. I have a question maybe which concerns a little bit the one which already was said. Yeah. I think that the premise of your theory is based on the fact that we always know that a character A talks to a character B. And I think that this is a very wrong premise. Sorry for that. But the whole, let's say, practice of theater shows that there is a lot of indetermination in this. And this is a very strong act of interpretation to decide if a person, if a character speaks, whether he or she speaks to this person or that person or a certain number of persons. So I think that your algorithm must have some, let's say, traumatism dilemma with this, with the assignment of concrete replics, speeches to the recipient. That's one question. And just another one, again, inspired by what you said, what were the most modern texts you worked with? Did you work with Beckett?
No,
yes, but are you going to use this for really modern texts like Sarah Kane? We know that the dramatic literature has changed enormously. So are you going to use it? You have texts where you have speeches, having no idea who speaks and to whom he speaks or she. So how far can this model be used? But the first question is maybe more important for me, because this is a very strong act of interpretation for me. Thanks.
Yeah. So that is indeed true. Someone speaks in a real play, not in a simulation. Who does he or she speak to? This you know, we started by doing these matrices by hand. That is to say, it was a person and not an algorithm who decided whether Claudius was speaking to Volteman, was speaking to Laertes, was speaking to Polonius, etc., etc. Then we decided to try and use an algorithm which worked on this premise. If A speaks and then B speaks, then A has spoken to B. The algorithm got it right in a range that went from 50% to 100%. The average was around 80%. And then at that point we decided that 80% was not accurate enough, so everything would have to be done by hand. That the algorithm would do the first choice, but then everything would be checked by hand. Was it a strong act of interpretation? In my opinion, honestly, almost never. At times, the logic that would given the algorithm would have made a mistake. But for a human reader, it's almost never a guess. There is one exception. When a character, and this includes characters speaking to themselves, so soliloquy. See, the circle here, this is the chorus speaking to no one, but simply a choral ode that is not even exactly addressed to the chorus, but you know, it's a monologue. It's a, the one exception is when a character on scene speaks to everybody. Like Claudius, in the second scene of the first act of Hamlet, he enters and he addresses everybody. How do you factor that everybody in? Scene by scene, you can include a fictional character, an actant, called all, or you know, everybody. But of course, everybody in scene 2 of Act 1 is different from everybody in scene 4 of Act 4, so it becomes unreasonable to have a single. Those we eliminated. It's a loss of a dimension of the play. And for instance, if one were to then proceed to a semantic analysis, one could extract all that you have not included in the networks and see if the semantics of that is significantly different from the semantics. But honestly, it is more of a pragmatic than a conceptual problem. We then realized, someone else had done this, that if you tell the algorithm, okay, A speaks, then B speaks, then A speaks, at that point you go back not one exchange but two, and so you assume that the first time A spoke was to B. And it's a much more realistic, and in this case the accuracy increases even more. But that said, I didn't, this, 50 plays or so, not even, because we had to check them all by hand. You can decide to let the algorithm do what it can, and 80% over 50,000 plays is still a percentage that will give you good results. I understand the logic of that. I don't feel comfortable doing that. So that's why this is so narrow as a study. As for the modern thing, well, actually, in the written text, which is longer than what I've read, as I explain how the parameters function, I illustrate it precisely with waiting for Godot. So, you know, A speaks to B and B replies, but at a certain point, they have to, even Vladimir and Estragon have to stop. And they stop, and if there are other characters on scene, because one of those parameters takes that into consideration, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I am not sure 20th century theater, or how much 20th century theater would prove difficult for this model. probably one-to-one exchange which is so clear in Ibsen, say. In Ibsen, you always know who's speaking to whom. There are semantic complications, but you always know that. That is obviously less true in the 20th century, but that's also interesting when a model no longer works. This helps you set in limit. You know, no model works for everything. So you say, okay, we created this model and it stops working in 20th century. Why? Then you see what presuppositions of the plays on which the model was based stop being active in the 20th century. It helps you making clarity in your own ideas.
Thank you for your lecture, and also for sharing with us your research. I find it interesting as it seems to combine science and arts. And my question is, are you going to continue with this work, and in that case, in what ways?
Yeah, right now I am in a phase in which what I most like to do is not so much new empirical studies, but reflection on empirical studies that have already been made, whether by us or by others. The last piece I've published on this was reflections on 67, I think, articles in quantitative cultural history by a lot of different people. And I've done empirical work for 10 years. I've enjoyed it a lot. It requires, strange as that sounds in today's world, working in a lab with data, it requires physical presence, at least in my case. I mean, I need to be, I have moved away from California 5 years ago, so I'm no longer really in touch with, it's a daily work almost. And if you're not there, if not every day, every week, to share ideas, to, you know, so much of the work happens because you talk and then there is a sudden little epiphany and you finally fix that problem that has kept you worried for months. So I think it's unlikely I will do more empirical work. I think it is likely I will do more things like that which I've done today.
So thank you for your lecture. I just have a quick question on your influences, because you mentioned the Russian formalism and structuralism, and I wanted to ask you whether you somehow considered in your research the approach of the network science and, for example, the approach of Albert László Barabási, who is one of the proposers of this approach, even though he doesn't basically examine the works, literary works, in the way that you do, but he is the author of the link of this anthology on this subject. So if
how do you think I got the idea of using network theory for drama? By reading Barabási's work. And then I read Newman, I read many others. But so, yes, the inspiration, not the inspiration, but the whole conceptual apparatus came from there. Absolutely. Then you try to see what is specific. For instance, neither Barabási nor Newman nor many others, for them edge weight is never a problem. And even in the simulation of networks, of real networks in the real world, etc., edge weight is never a problem. For us, it's the biggest problem. So here you have an interesting case in which you import a theory in a field which, given the objects in that field, requires something that the theory itself potentially has there, but has never really activated. Do you see? So the theory is certainly the starting point for all this, and it did not provide all the answers we needed, which is a good thing. I mean, or anyway, it's not a good thing, but it's, you know, it forced us to think.
Sorry, one more question. Is the data available? So either simple yes or no question, and
no.
You can, if you wish, you can expand like on your thoughts about the reproducibility that's enabled in the humanities by using these approaches.
So the data, the first of the works we published, we made the data available after publishing, yes. There was a simple, like a gate that we wanted to know who wanted access to the data. That was all. But 300 people got the data. No one ever did anything with them or said anything to us about it. So we thought, okay, this business of the data being available, which is a big pain in the neck because much of this data has been extracted by collections that belong to Stanford that are under, in the United States, it's no joke, property rights. And so it took months of negotiations with the library. We go to all this trouble and no one does anything with it, forget it. From now on, we want it. This was a comprehensible reaction on our parts, on my part especially, and now maybe we could reconsider, but now the lab has a different director, I have nothing to do with it, so in theory they can make it available. I know that they haven't yet. I repeat, in the US, it's not a simple thing. I know other people actually do it. We encountered great difficulty when we did so.
Okay, the last question for $64.
The last question, come on.
Is there any? It's exception. Okay.
There are two. Okay. The lady down there, the last two questions.
Please.
And then the man who wants me to do more work.
Mohu mluvit česky? Ano. Mohu se zeptat, prosím, když děkuji za to, co jste nám řekl. Napadla vás tato myšlenka, když jste šel ulicemi, anebo když jste četl nějaký dramata? Kde? Jestli na ulici nebo v knize?
Okay, I will translate. That's a question about your inspiration. Where concretely this idea of dramatic networks fell into your mind? It was a street, some cabin, bathtub, by reading a drama?
No, so it occurred to me this is going to be a little embarrassing, a little ridiculous, not embarrassing at all, but ridiculous. I was reading Barabashi. At night in the Hawaii, it's the only time I've been in the Hawaii, instead of surfing or doing the things people do, I was reading network theory and I had an idea of doing this. So that's where it happened. It was, in the terrace of our room in this island of Maui or wherever it was. And then there is.
And the second.
So it was this was all the question, correct?
Okay.
Just a small question, or I don't know. Where does the audience come in, if at all? I mean, you could consider that the chorus is actually speaking to the audience.
Everybody is speaking to the audience.
Well, yeah. So is that the answer?
For me, yes. I mean, everybody is speaking to the audience. That's a given in the theater. Yes.
Okay.
So, and now the same message for the stage, for Franca Moretti, and for the audience. Thank you for coming.